In today's video, I'm going to show you how to inspect and replace your rear axle seal and bearing on a Ram 1500. Replacing the rear axle seal and bearing on the Ram 1500 is a pretty straightforward process. The first step is to jack the vehicle up and take off your tires. Next, we're going to pull off the brakes and the rotors so we can expose the hub. To take off the caliper and bracket, I'm just going to skip the caliper portion and pull off the bolts for the bracket, which is going to be a 21 millimeter. We'll hang up the bracket and caliper, and then we'll take off the rotor. So because I'm doing both sides, seals and bearings, I'm going to take the brakes off on both ends and just have everything ready to go at one time. So now that we've got both sides, brakes taken apart and the rotors off, we're ready to start draining the fluid. So now that we're ready to drain the rear end, we're going to be using a hex 14 to release the drain plug. I've already cracked it loose, so you want to be careful. If it hasn't been out in a long time, you're going to want to take it slow to get it started. So you'll want to stick a drain pan underneath to catch the fluid. So we're going to clean off the drain plug now and then add a little pipe sealant before we put it back in. So now that the fluid is completely drained, you're able to put the drain plug back in. We've got a little bit of sealant on the threads here, so we're going to throw in the drain plug here. We're going to do it by hand until we're tight, and then we're going to switch over to the torque wrench. So the torque spec for the drain plug is 52 pounds. So if you're just changing the fluids, at this point you're now ready to refill the system. In the case that you're servicing the diff, doing seals or bearings, we're now going to pop the cover off. So now that we're ready to remove the 12 bolts, I've gone around and broke them free by hand. I'm using a gun to rip them out, but I wanted to break them by hand just in case they're a little stubborn. You don't want to risk stripping any of these bolts because it's going to be extremely hard to get them back out after. So I'm going to leave this last bolt just loosely threaded in, and we're going to tap the bottom of the cover open. We're going to leave that top bolt in so when the cover breaks the seal, the cover doesn't drop and fall. So now that we have the cover loose, we're going to take this top bolt out. I'm just going to hold the cover in the fill hole here. We're going to pull it off fully. I'm going to drop it down, watching the gears on the inside. So now that we have the cover off, we're just going to take a moment and scrape off all the excess material. So now that we've got the cover off and the diffs exposed, we're going to put the vehicle into neutral. We're going to move the drive shaft so this bolt here will line up with this slit so we can pull the bolt out and release both the axles. So you want to make sure when you have the vehicle in neutral, you do have the front wheels chalked so the vehicle cannot go anywhere. So that should be enough room now to get this bolt out past that slit. So the bolt here is an 8mm that we're removing. So you want to take your time when you're taking this out. And you also want to make sure you have somewhere clean to put it. So I have my magnet tray and I laid down a couple paper towels just to stick the bolt onto. As well as the same with the pin. So now that we have the bolt out, we're able to remove the pin. So I need to adjust the diff a little bit more. Just to clear the bar here. We've now got it out. So now that we've got the pin and the screw out, we're ready to remove the axle C-clamp. So what's going to happen now is when we go to the outside, we can push in on the hub and there's a little C-clamp that's going to fall out. When that does, we can take that out and we'll be able to remove the axle. So what we're going to do is start with the left side. So as I push in on this hub now, the C-clip fell out. So we're going to place that aside and we're going to remove the axle on the left side. So again, now that we've got the C-clip out, we can start to pull the axle out. So we want to be careful that we're not shuffling it back and forth. We want to remove it in one smooth. So you need to tilt up a little bit. So it's going to drop and you want to tilt it upwards to get it removed. And we can now pull the whole tube out. and we're going to place this aside. So now that we're ready to remove the seal, I'm going to show you two different tools. We're going to use a split collet puller first. Let's see if we can get the seal out with it. So now that we've got the seal out, we're going to install the bearing puller. Now that we've got the seal clip bearing out, we're just going to clean the surface here. I'm going to use some brake clean to clean off the area here. Just be careful that you're not spraying into the actual opening. So now that we're ready to reinstall the bearing, we've got the new one here. I'm using a 63 millimeter. It's just a little bit smaller than what the bearing is. So you'll want to basically place the bearing in. We're now ready to install the seal. So we're using the same tool, but we're going to be using the 76 millimeter installer. So you want this one to be, again, bigger than the seal is. You could use like a block of wood or something along those lines, but if you've already got the set, it's easy just to use this. So you want to stop every little while, make sure it's going in all the way around at one time. So I'm a little low on the bottom here, so I'm going to lean more towards the bottom. I'm pretty close to being fully seated. Just going to give it a couple more taps. Just a little bit more on the bottom. And I'm happy with the way that looks. So the last thing we're going to do before we reinstall the actual axle is just pre-soak the bearing on the inside here. You could do this prior to installing, but the gear oil is pretty messy, so I generally wait until it's installed. So to reinstall this axle, it's pretty simple. You're just going in reverse here. I pre-marked the top of my axle so I knew which way it came out, so I can stick it back in the same direction. So as you get towards the bottom, the back here, you may have to give a little bit back and forth to try to get the splines to line back up. Right now, we're going to jump under and I'm going to show you how to reinstall the C-clip. So now that I've got the axle fully pushed in, I'm able to take the C-clip, slide it back into place here on the end of the axle. It should easily slide on, so if you're struggling to get it on, that means the axle isn't enough. I just push the axle back in by hand. That's enough to hold the C-clip in place. We're now ready to start the right-hand side. So again, we're going to push in on the axle and drop the C-clip out. So we've now got our C-clip out and we're ready to pull out the axle on the right side. So again, I'm going to mark my axle so I know which way it's come out. So again, we just dropped, lift up a very slight amount, and we can pull the whole axle out. So now that we're ready to remove the axle, I'm going to use a different tool here. It's a seal puller. The split collet did okay, but it did leave a small portion of the actual seal in that the bearing puller removed for us. So we'll try this and we'll see how it does. Seems to be doing okay. It is right at the bottom, but it doesn't want to fully come out one piece. I may end up having to use the bearing puller to get this portion out. We'll see if I can get it out right now. So it doesn't want to be coming out. It keeps snapping here, so I'm losing the tension point. So I'm going to install the bearing puller and I should be able to pull it out in one whole piece. So I've got the bearing puller reinstalled here again. So one thing to keep in mind, when you have this much leakage, you would want to actually replace the e-brake shoes. Currently mine are on back orders, so the seal for me was leaking pretty bad. I was losing quite a bit inside of a week. So I wanted to get these changed over now, and I'm going to come back later and then replace the shoes plus the actual main brakes in the back here. Again, we're just going to take some time, re-clean everything up back here, make sure the old seal is gone, and we'll install the new bearing and seal. So again, now that we're ready to install the new bearing, I'm just going to place it in there. We're using the 63mm again. We have to go a little bit more. And that's it. You can hear that dead sound, letting you know the bearing is fully seated in. We're now ready to move on to the seal. So we're now ready to do the seal. So a couple things to keep in mind when you're making the decision about installing a new seal or a new bearing is you may want to consider doing both on both sides, or if you just have the seal leaking, consider doing the bearing. Because you're going to have it open, that's the time to do it all. Just going to give it a couple more taps here. And I'm happy we're inserted all the way around. We're ready to reinstall the axle. So again, before we go and install the axle, we're just going to add in a bit of gear oil again on the bearing. And we can now install the axle. So again, I've got it marked on the top so I know which direction I took it out on. So again, now that we've got the axle installed all the way in, we're going to jump on underneath and reinstall the C-clip. So again, we're ready to put the C-clip back in. We've got the axle pushed in all the way. I've installed on the axle. I've pushed back. And now the axle's reinstalled. So what we're going to do now and the screw. My pin's a little far in. So the magnet makes it a lot easier, so you can align the pin. So the torque spec for this bolt is 19 foot-pounds. So we're good there. We're waiting on the diff cover to dry because we repainted it. So at this time, we're going to start putting the brakes and the tires back on, and then we'll come back to do the cover and refill the diff. So now that we're ready to put everything back together, we're quickly just going to clean everything before we put the rotor and the brakes back on. Now that we've got the brakes back together, we're ready to put the wheel back on. So now that we're ready to reinstall the diff cover, we've cleaned off any of the bulk old RTV. I'm going to be using an actual gasket sealer for gear oil. What you want to do is follow around the threads, align around the thread line. Now that we've got our TV all around the cover, we want to make sure when we put it on here, we're not bumping into the gears. I've got a bolt already ready. We're going to put it on, move it around a little bit, and then we're going to mount one of the top bolts and then one of the bottom, and then we'll slowly get all the bolts put on. All right, so we've got it on. We're just going to move the cover around. So we've got it on. We're going to install one of the bolts down here. This is going to help us align the cover fully. So now that we've got all the bolts hand tight, we're going to torque them all down to 32 foot-pounds. So now that we've gone around and made sure all the bolts are tight, we're just going to double check, make sure we didn't miss any. We went in a cross pattern to make sure the cover torqued down evenly all the way around. So now that we've got the cover reinstalled, all the bolts down are torqued. We're going to allow the RTV time to set up, and then we'll come back and fill up the differential. So we've now allowed the RTV enough time to cure. We're ready to fill up the diff now. So for the ram, for the rear end, it calls for 75/40. If your vehicle has a limited slip differential, you'll want to make sure the fluid you're adding in has an additive already, or you're going to be adding it in. Mine doesn't have one, but the fluid that I have already has an additive, so it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. We're going to be using a transfer pump to fill this up, so let's jump underneath and I'll show you how to do it. So to fill up the differential, there's multiple different ways you can do it. You can use the new squeeze bag styles, try to squeeze a bottle in there, but I find the transfer pump is the easiest. So for the capacity of the ram, it's basically going to need about 3 full bottles. It'll be a little bit shy. So the way that you'll know when it's full is once you put in enough fluid, you'll start to see a bit of a run out. You basically want it filled right to the rim on here. That's allowing you to know that you have enough fluid. So that's one bottle empty. We're going to get another full bottle. So we just finished off our second bottle. We're going to get the third bottle, and we're going to keep an eye on it because we know that 3 full bottles is a little bit too much. So we're going to be just shy of the third full bottle. So now that we're ready with the third bottle, I reduced the bottle to about 3/4. What I'm going to do is empty that 3/4 out, and then we're going to check the level manually and then add as needed. So I checked the level manually, but as you could see now, I added a little bit more. And you see the run out there? That's letting us know the differential's full. So we're just going to let that run out for a second, and then we are going to put the cap back in. So now that the bulk of the excess fluid has drained out, we're ready to throw the cap back in. So we've got the rubber cap here. I'm just going to clean the diff housing down with a little bit of brake clean. And just like that, We've refilled the fluid on the differential. This has been a pretty in-depth video on how to drain your diff, remove your axle bearing and seals, and replace them with new. If you enjoy this content or you have any questions, like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.